Court is now in session.
You may be seated. United States District Court is back in session. We'll hear the remainder of the prosecution's witnesses. You may proceed.
Your Honor, the state's next witness is James Townsley.
Mr. Townsley, will you come forward and be sworn?
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Could I ask that the courtroom be quiet so we can hear this witness?
Sir, would you state your name for the jury, please?
Yes, sir. I'm James Townsley.
And how old are you?
I'm 42 years old.
And back in May of 1856, where did you live?
I lived in Anderson County, Kansas, near Potawatomi Creek.
And had you lived there a long time?
I'd only lived there a few months. I moved there from Maryland in October of 1855.
Now, can you describe for the jury what were your beliefs as far as pro-slavery or anti-slavery?
I'm very much anti-slavery. I was a free stater. That's why I moved to Kansas, to make sure that Kansas became a free state.
Now, can you describe for the jury, were you on a raid with this defendant, John Brown, on the night of Saturday, May 24th of 1856?
Well, on May 24th?
Yes, that's Saturday night.
That Saturday night. Yes, I was.
And how did you happen to be on that raid that night?
Well, a few days earlier, I was a part of something called the Potawatomi Rifle Company with Mr. Brown. And we had heard that a bunch of Missourians were coming over to Kansas to raid Lawrence. And so we got together, the Potawatomi Rifle Company, to head to Lawrence to defend Lawrence.
And what happened?
Well, on our way there, we learned that we were a little late and that Lawrence was already gone. And then Mr. Brown came up with the idea that we should, he told me that he wanted me to take him and his boys back to Potawatomi because he had heard that there was something going on at Potawatomi and he needed to get back there to take care of it.
Did you agree to take him to the Potawatomi Creek area?
Yes, I had a team and a wagon, and I took him and his boys back.
And that was your home community?
That was my home community, yes.
And you knew where people lived in that community?
Yes.
And you knew where the pro-slavery people lived and where the anti-slavery people
Generally,
lived?
yes, sir.
Now, describe for the jury then what happened then that night of May 24th, a Saturday night, 1856.
Well, that night, despite my feelings against it, I really didn't want to do it. I was ordered, we were ordered by old John Brown to march into up the creek, up into the forks of the creek, to go to the houses of the pro-slavery people.
And did you show John Brown where James Doyle's house was?
Yes, I did.
Now, had you gone to another house before James Doyle's house?
Yes. First thing we did, we got up there and we crossed the creek, and there was another cabin up there, and there wasn't anybody home. Somebody knocked on the door, wasn't anybody home. But then we went on to the Doyle's cabin.
And was it about 11 o'clock at night when you got to James Doyle's cabin?
Yes, sir, it was.
Describe who all was along besides you and Old Man Brown. Who all was along?
It was Brown's sons. It was Owen Brown and Oliver Brown and Salmon Brown and Watson Brown. And then he had a son-in-law, old John Brown's son-in-law, Henry Thompson. And then Mr. Weiner was with us, too.
So on that party, that gang that was along that night, all of them were John Brown and John Brown's immediate family, his sons and his son-in-law, except two people, you and Mr. Weiner.
That's correct.
Describe what happened then when you got to James Doyle's house.
Well, when we got there, old John Brown and his boys went into the house, all but one, Frederick Brown. I think I failed to mention that Frederick Brown is one of those. Frederick Brown and Mr. Weiner and I stayed outside. And while we were out there, a big dog came up on us and attacked us, but we took care of him.
When you say you took care of the dog, what did you do to the dog?
Well, first Fred Brown pulled out his sword and swiped at him, and then I had a saber too, and I took it out, and I hit the dog, and the dog ran off. So.
Now, were every member of that gang armed that night?
Oh yeah, we all were. We were armed for battle in Lawrence, so everybody had a sidearm or a knife or a saber.
Could you hear what was being said inside the Doyle home?
No, sir.
And what happened then after John Brown and some of his sons went into the home?
Well, they were in there a few minutes, and then they came out with James Doyle and his two sons, and they marched them out, and old John Brown had his pistol, had a revolver on him, and when they walked out away from the house, old John Brown pulled up the revolver and shot James Doyle in the head.
How quickly did he shoot him compared to when they had come outside?
Well, pretty much right away.
And how close was he to him at the time he shot him in the head?
He was right in front of him. He couldn't miss.
And then what happened?
Well, one of the boys, I guess it was Salmon Brown, stabbed him in the chest.
When he stabbed him, who did he stab in the chest?
He stabbed James Doyle in the chest.
And was that about the same time as being shot or after he was down from being shot?
It was about the same. I mean, he was shot, and I think it was after he was down. Yeah, I mean, it happened pretty quickly. But he pulled out his sword and stabbed him in the commotion.
What happened then after John Brown shot James Doyle and Salmon Brown had stabbed James Doyle?
Well, then the two youngest Brown boys, I guess it's Owen and Salmon, jumped on the two Doyle boys.
And as to William Doyle, who was it that attacked him?
That was Owen Brown.
And describe for the jury what Owen Brown did to William
Well,
Doyle.
he started hacking him with the sword. He hit him in the head and stabbed him in the side, I think, and then it looked like he tried to cut his head off, but I think he hit him in the mouth. But
what happened next?
While that was going on, the other Doyle boy, I guess his name's Drury, he ran off, and Salmon took off after him.
And what happened
well,
at that point?
Salmon caught him and started hitting him with his sword, and he killed him.
And could you see Salmon slashing with the sword?
Oh, yeah, it was very clear in the moonlight.
Now, before you all had gone on the raid that night, had Old Man Brown, John Brown, made any comments to you about the purpose of this raid that night?
Yes, sir, he did. He said he wanted to sweep the creek of pro-slavery men. He wanted to make sure that the pro-slavery men knew that they weren't wanted around there, and he wanted to make sure that they were scared of the Free Staters.
Now, besides James Doyle, had he mentioned others by name that he wanted to go after?
He talked about Dutch Henry, talked about Alan Wilkinson, and he talked about a probate judge named George Wilson.
Now, how was John Brown armed?
Well, he had a revolver, the revolver he used to shoot James Doyle, and he also had a sword.
Now, did John Brown or anybody in your party have any ropes or cuffs or chains to take prisoners alive?
No, sir.
Now, after the three Doyles were killed, where did your party go next?
Well, then we went down the creek to Alan Wilkinson's house.
And describe for the jury what happened at Alan Wilkinson's house.
Well, it kind of happened about the same way as with the Doyle's house, in that I think it was Frederick Brown, and for some reason or other, I want to stay out there, but for some reason or other, they kept keeping Frederick Brown and Mr. Weiner out there with me. And then old John Brown and the other boys went into the house, and they were in there for a few minutes. And then they brought Alan Wilkinson out barefoot and walked him south of the house. And then Salmon Brown attacked him with his sword. He hit him in the head and then stabbed him, I think it was in the side, and then he grabbed him by the hair and slashed his throat a couple times.
How many
Order in this courtroom. Order.
How many times did Salmon Brown slash the throat of Alan Wilkinson?
at least twice. Looked like he was trying to saw his head off or something.
Now, do you recall at my office that you met with me and made a diagram of the injuries that you saw to Alan Wilkins's body?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I'd offer at this time State's Exhibit 10.
Objections.
And would you point out to the jury where was the injury, the injuries? Where were the injuries?
Well, like I said, he first hit him in the head. That kind of knocked him down. I think that's where that big gash across the top of his head was. And then he stabbed the sword in his belly and pulled it up, and so that shows that slash there on his right side. And then he grabbed him by the head and slashed at his throat a couple times.
Now, after you all left the Wilkinson house, where did you go next?
Well, then we went down to close to the Potawatomi. Went down to Mr. Harris's house. Well, first we went to Dutch Henry's house. Was
anybody home at Dutch Henry's?
Dutch Henry's, there wasn't anybody home. So then that's when we went over to the Harris house.
And was that real close to Dutch Henry's?
Yes, it was.
Describe what happened at the Harris home.
Well, like the other times, old John Brown and his boys, all but Frederick Brown and Mr. Weiner and I, they all went inside, and we stayed outside.
Could you hear what was going on inside?
Not really, no.
What happened then that you could see and hear as far as anybody coming outside?
Well, that's what happened. I mean, old John Brown and I don't know, one of his boys or one or two of them brought somebody out and talked to him for a minute. They stood away from me. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but then they took him back in, and then they brought somebody else out and talked to him and took him back in, and I can't remember if there was two or three, but it was at least two guys, and then they went back in, and then they brought out Dutch Bill Sherman, Dutch Henry's brother.
Was William Sherman then the last person that John Brown brought out?
Yes, sir.
And once he brought him out, what happened?
Well, they marched him down to the creek next to Potawatomi Creek, and Salmon Brown again took his sword and went after him.
And what could you see?
Well, I saw him hacking at him, and he raised his hand and it basically cut his hand off, or pretty much, and then he hit him in the head and had a big old gash in his head, and I think he then hit him. He stabbed him in the chest, I guess, for good measure, and twisted it around pretty good. But it was pretty gruesome. There's brains all over. And
now the jury's heard a lot of injuries to these 5 different bodies. Were any of these injuries inflicted as far as mutilating bodies after they're already dead?
Oh, you mean that talk about how he was coming back after they were already... No, this was all part of the killing process. I mean, it was pretty brutal. They were swinging the swords pretty hard.
Now, have you lived in the Potawatomi Creek area since the time of these murders?
Yes, sir.
What was the reaction of the pro-slavery people?
The pro-slavery are scared. A lot of them have left. And some of them say now that one Free State man can scare off a whole army of pro-slavery people.
Now, did this group that you were with that night, did it have a leader?
Yes, definitely. Old John Brown.
And who was the leader?
Old John Brown.
And
he was the father of all the boys.
And what was he doing in his capacity as leader?
Well, he was ordering them to kill pro-slavery men.
And do you see in the courtroom today the old John Brown, who is the one who had selected the houses of who was going to live and die, and the man who ordered his sons to help him commit these murders?
Yes, I do.
And which person is John Brown?
That's old John Brown right there with the silver hair.
May the record reflect the witnesses identified the defendant, Your Honor?
So noted.
No further questions.
Cross.
Defense exhibits, please. Now, Mr. Townsley, you arrived in Kansas with your family in October of 1855, did you not?
That's correct.
And you were opposed to slavery. You knew of its horrors from your earlier life in Maryland, which is in fact a slave state, correct?
Yes, sir.
And within 7 months, by May of 1856, you had joined the Potawatomi Rifle Company, correct?
Yes, sir.
You're a military man, are you not?
Yes, sir.
In fact, you spent 5 years under General Taylor fighting the Seminoles in the Creeks in Florida.
That's correct.
So you know that war is real and guns aren't just for show, and you didn't feel any particular need to be a pretend soldier to march around on the green and impress the girls.
I don't understand what you mean,
You
sir,
joined the
but-
Potawatomi Rifles for a reason, did you not?
Yes, sir.
And you joined the Potawatomi Rifles because Free State men in Kansas were under threat, correct?
Yes, sir.
And they were under threat from pro-slavery locals, yes.
Yes, sir.
And they were under threat particularly from bands of Missourians coming across the border to attack, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, on May the 22nd of 1856, the Potawatomi Rifles assembled, right?
I think it was on May 21st, but yes,
May
sir.
have been the 21st, but the reason for that was to go over to Lawrence because Lawrence was under threat of attack from a group of pro-slavery Missourians, correct?
That's right, sir.
And what was the particular importance of Lawrence?
Well, Lawrence had been a town that was settled primarily by Free Staters.
That's right. And were the good people of Lawrence hatching plots to go out and slay their foes out in the hinterlands of Kansas, as far as you know?
I don't know, sir.
Were they assembling an army to invade the South?
I don't know.
Okay. In fact, they were just living there and, like yourself, opposing slavery in Kansas, were they not?
To the best of my knowledge,
But
yes,
that
sir.
was enough for the slave power to assemble an invading army to come over and sack the place, correct?
I don't know why they did it, sir.
But you went over there to protect that town, did you not?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, did you get there in time?
No, sir.
And in fact, the invading Missourians sacked the town. They blew up the newspapers, they blew up the hotel, they burned the place, they ransacked it, did they not?
That's what I heard.
And at
Yes,
least
sir.
one person was killed, was he not?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you found out that you were not in time to assist your Free State brethren over in Lawrence, you were confused, indecisive at first?
Yeah, we didn't really know what to do.
Okay. But only John Brown, according to you, had a plan.
He had a plan.
Yes.
I didn't say he's the only one who had a plan, but he's the one who had a plan.
And you said, and according
had
to
the
you,
plan.
he said there was trouble on Potawatomi Creek, and he asked you to take him down to Potawatomi Creek.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't ask what kind of trouble there was.
No, not
No,
really.
you just loaded everybody in your wagon and rode down to Potawatomi Creek, correct? According to you.
Yes, sir.
Even though, apparently later on, Brown, according to you, says he's going to sweep the creek of pro-slavery men, correct?
He hadn't told me that when we went down there.
Yes, but at some point he did he not?
After we got there.
Yeah, and you supposedly refused to participate in sweeping the creek. Is
I
that
didn't
correct?
supposedly refuse to. I did refuse to.
Oh, you basically portray yourself and what happens thereafter as an innocent bystander. Isn't that correct, Mr. Townsend?
I don't portray myself as an innocent bystander. I say I am somebody who is opposed to murder.
Yes, well, let's talk about that a moment. Apparently, when you said you wouldn't participate, why didn't you leave?
I was scared.
Ah, you were
I was
scared.
one of about 6 or 8 men, and most of them there were bloodthirsty, wanted to go kill those men. I was opposed to it.
Ah, and you were afraid. You, the old military man, the only person with military experience, the old Indian fighter, in a group of civilians headed by an old man. But you were afraid even to say no in the face of this horrible, horrible thing that was going to happen, right?
You paint them as awfully soft. They were brutal men. Sir.
Ah, and you were there in their company, I think. Now, you were the only witness, curiously, who seems to have claimed to have seen John Brown kill anyone. Correct?
I don't know.
Well, why might that be? Truth is, Mr. Townsend,
I don't
you
have an
went on
answer for
this
the question
venture-
because I don't assume that it's true.
You went on this venture willingly, and if John Brown is guilty of any crime, so are you. And if he deserves death, so are you. So do you. Isn't that true?
An objection calls for speculation.
Objection sustained.
Well, you're not here wholly voluntarily, are you, Mr. Townsley?
Sir,
The answer is either yes or no. Are you here voluntarily or not?
well, I'm here voluntarily.
Ah, but in fact, Mr. Townsley, hello, you're here pursuant to a plea agreement with the United States, you're not?
Yes, sir.
A plea agreement in which you plead guilty to a crime, correct?
Yes, sir.
A plea agreement for which the maximum penalty is actually only 5 years imprisonment, correct? A plea agreement pursuant to which you also have an agreement with the United States such that if they are pleased with your testimony here today, they'll make a motion to reduce your sentence even further, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct, is it not? And so, Mr. Townsley, you are here today, even though if anyone, Mr. Brown is guilty, so are you. You are here today.
I didn't kill anybody, sir.
You are here today, Mr. Townsley, in order to avoid death.
No, I'm here to testify to the prosecution of a man who killed a bunch of people.
A man you were alone with. Now,
Not
one
willingly,
other
sir.
question, Mr. Townsley. You say in your statement, you said in testimony a moment ago that Mr. Brown hoped to find a George Wilson, a probate judge in Anderson County. And that was because Wilson had been notifying, in your words, Free State men to leave the territory, correct?
That's true. He
In fact,
notified me, too.
That's right, and he gave a notice to you yourself, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that wasn't polite advice, was it? It was a threat, was it not?
Absolutely it was.
And why did you not appeal to the law against such threats?
I didn't adhere to the threat. I stayed.
Yeah, but why did you not appeal to the law when you received such a threat from a judge?
I don't know.
Isn't it true because the slavers controlled the law in Kansas, that because the man who threatened you was the law in Kansas?
That's true.
Now, you say you didn't go along with or approve the killings at the time, but later on you wrote, did you not, in after time, I became satisfied that it resulted in good to the Free State cause and was especially beneficial to the Free State settlers on Pottawatomie Creek. You wrote that, did you not?
I did write that.
Because the threats stopped.
Yes, sir, they did. But that doesn't-
Because the slavers who thought that Free State men were pacifist weaklings found out to the contrary, correct?
Well, I don't know exactly what the reasoning was, but I'd say that the killings intimidated them, and they stopped threatening the Free Staters.
The truth is, Mr. Townsley, you knew then, you know now, that what was done that night was necessary to keep the corruption of slavery from the soil of Kansas and to protect the peaceful settlers, the Free State settlers of Kansas. But you don't have the courage to say so.
No, I think what happened helped. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it lawful. He killed Christian men. I'm sorry, that's what happened. He pulled men out of their homes and killed them. He didn't kill them on the field of battle. I would have marched into the field of battle with him, but I was against pulling them out of their homes and killing them in cold blood.
In fact, you were along willingly. And if you were not along willingly, Mr. Townsley, you would never have made the agreement that you made. It's a lovely agreement, Mr. Townsley. It's an interesting choice. There's only one thing that the government's failed to give you. Put out your hand, if you would. The 30 pieces of silver. No further questions.
No redirect necessary, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. The witness is excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the prosecution calls its final witness, Lieutenant Josiah Bass, to the stand.
Lieutenant Bass, will you come forward and be sworn?
The prosecution will not have exhibits on the PowerPoint, Your Honor. So if I could ask for a black screen.
Could we take the screen? Thank you.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Lieutenant Bass, you are quite well armed.
I am. Thank you for noticing, Honor.
Could you explain the purpose of these arms?
Ma'am, this is my service revolver and sword. Major General Reed.
There are no exceptions in this courtroom. Would you give your weapons to the bailiff?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
could you please state your name for the court?
Josiah Bass.
And do you have a position in the military?
Yes, I'm a lieutenant.
Lieutenant Bass, were you a member of a military organization in 1856?
Yes, I was.
And what was that organization?
It was Major General Reed's Volunteers.
Were you part of a group that went over to Kansas in August of 1856?
Yes, I was.
Could you describe for the jury what your actions were in that battle?
Yes, I had volunteered for Major General Reed's Army, and we had set out for Kansas to confront John Brown and his murderous gang of abolitionists in Osawatomie, Kansas. And
did you ever encounter the defendant?
Yes, we did.
Could you tell the jury about that encounter?
Sure can. In late August, we encountered the defendant near Osawatomie. We had engaged him in battle. After a fierce confrontation, we had managed to put John Brown and his gang to flight, at which point I pursued him on horseback, ran him over with my steed, and while he was dazed and confused, proceeded to place him into custody.
Were you able to recover any pieces of evidence from Mr. Brown's body?
Yes, I was.
Can you tell the jury about what the evidence was?
I recovered several weapons and a telegram. I believe a pistol, a broadsword, and a Sharps rifle.
Lieutenant, I'm handing you what's been previously marked as Exhibit 12. Do you recognize Exhibit 12?
I do. This is John Brown's double-edged broadsword.
Is it sharp on both sides of that sword?
Indeed, as all broadswords that are double-edged are.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would move to admit State's Exhibit 12.
No objection, Your Honor.
Admitted.
Now, I'm also handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 13. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 13?
I do.
Be careful not to point it at me.
Sure thing. I do recognize this. This is John Brown's revolver, the one that I removed from his person when I apprehended him.
And, Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would move to admit State's Exhibit 13 into evidence.
No objection.
Admitted.
Lieutenant Bass, I'm handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 14. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 14?
I do. This is the rifle that I confiscated from John Brown.
Your Honor, the prosecution would move to admit State's Exhibit 14 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Admitted.
Now, finally, Lieutenant Bass, I'd like to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 15. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 15?
This I do.
What is State's Exhibit 15?
This is the Western Union Telegraph I removed from John Brown.
Is it a fair and accurate copy of that telegram?
It would appear to be so.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would move Exhibit 15 into evidence.
Any objection to this?
No objection, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
Lieutenant Bass, could you read this telegram that you found on John Brown's person?
Certainly. Received at Springfield, Mass., 23rd May, 1856. To John Brown. Word just received. Senator Sumner assaulted in Senate by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Stop. Sumner savagely beaten while trapped by desk. Stop. Sumner's life despair of. Stop. We are not safe from the slave drivers, even in the capital of this country. Stop. Be on your guard. Stop. Augustus, Washington.
Now, Lieutenant Bass, is John Brown the person you arrested with this sword, pistol, and rifle present here in court today?
Yes, he is.
Could you please point him out, sir?
That gentleman right there with the gray hair.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Defense exhibits, please. Now, Lieutenant Bass. You're the son of Eli Bass, are you not?
I am indeed. The one and only.
There he is it not? That's your father.
That is him.
And Eli Bass is the largest landholder in Boone County, is he not?
I believe so.
And also the largest slaveholder, is he not?
I don't make it a habit of counting slaves, but he does have a few.
It's more than a few. You grew up on Forest Hill, the family plantation near Ashland, your 36-room mansion, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And you were constantly attended by slaves, were you not?
We had slaves there.
And in fact, your family prosperity and your own personal future prospects depend on slavery, do they not?
Depend on slavery? What exactly do you mean by that?
In order to maintain the luxurious, lazy lifestyle which you currently enjoy, you need your family to keep slaves to work for you in the fields and to serve you in the home. Any further clarification required?
Need? I don't know. We are entitled to. It is
Yes.
our right.
We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, you attend college at the State University here in Columbia, do you not?
That I do.
And the president of the State University is one James Shannon, is it not?
It is.
And is that Mr. Shannon?
Yes, it is.
And Mr. Shannon is a Disciples of Christ preacher, is he not?
He is. He's
Who
a Christian
preaches
man.
powerful pro-slavery sermons,
He does.
which I'm sure you have heard.
Objection, Your Honor. There is no relevance to these men of Boone County. This lieutenant is here to testify about arresting John Brown, not the men who live in this good county.
Your Honor, first of all, I think the defendant's or the witness's views regarding slavery are entirely germane to his bias against my client. And moreover, as the court knows, the defense in this case is one of necessity, and we intend to establish through this witness a number of facts about the institution of slavery which are relevant to the necessity defense.
The objection is overruled, but you will recall that this trial is limited to the trial of John Brown, not of slavery.
Your Honor, if I might, I have to take respectful disagreement with that contention. Indeed, our defense is precisely that of necessity, precisely that John Brown was obliged to make a choice of evils. And a good portion of the defense in this case is that one of the evils against which he was faced was that of slavery.
The objection was overruled. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Make sure it's relevant to this witness.
Now, Mr. Shannon advised you and other students to drop your books and take up arms and invade Kansas, did he not?
What Mr. Shannon told us, and what I believe, is that scriptures condone slavery, and he had stressed to us the importance of abiding by the Word of God. And as a Christian man, I took his words to heart and decided to take action.
You also wanted to, as you said a moment ago, to protect your rights.
Indeed.
Okay,
And
and those would be your rights to hold human property, would they not?
I believe it is my constitutional right to own slaves.
Your right to take your ease in your 36-room mansion built with the sweat of another man's labor, correct?
It is my right to own slaves.
Your right to beat a black man bloody if he doesn't please you. That right as well.
It is my constitutionally protected right to own slaves.
Now, you live here in Columbia, and you're familiar with the Flat Branch area, are you not?
I am.
And so you're familiar with the whipping post that's kept down there for slaves in this town, are you not?
I am indeed.
And so among your other rights is the right to kill a black man without due process of law, without fear of anything more than a fine, correct?
It is my right and my duty and the duty of all of us to enforce the laws of this country. And if
you're a man in favor of the law, are you, and your family as well?
Indeed.
Yes. Do you recognize this man?
Not particularly, no.
You should. You don't recognize Hiram. This was a slave owned by Colonel Edward Young, taken out of the Columbia jail on August the 22nd of 1853, and lynched a few hundred yards from here by a mob headed by your father. Did you miss that event?
That may have happened.
Now, among the other rights that you believed you were protecting by going into Missouri is the right to take your pleasure with the female members of slave members of your household, correct?
Yes.
You recognize this young fellow?
Can't say that I do.
Oddly enough, you don't recognize him even though he's your nephew.
That
your
may-
brother William's son?
My brother William is a bit older than I, and we do not. I do not.
You
live
certainly
with him.
know one of the slaves in the household named Cornelia, do you not?
I do.
Yes, and you don't recognize that this is your nephew, Tom Bass, by your brother and Cornelia. You don't know that.
That may be, but I do not condone William's behavior in that respect.
Tom Bass. Good with horses, I think. In any case, to protect your rats, you joined a vigilante gang and you invaded Kansas, did you not?
It was not a vigilante gang.
Not a vigilante gang. You called yourself, I believe, the Missouri Volunteers.
Indeed.
That uniform you're wearing, it's not a uniform from the United States Army, is it, Lieutenant?
No, it's not.
No, it's not. In fact, the military unit which you claim to belong to is not an official military unit of any governmental organization, is it, Lieutenant?
It is Major General Reed's army.
Yes, Major General Reed's own private vigilante army. By what legal authority did you leave Missouri to invade a United States territory, Lieutenant?
I was unaware of any legal authority. I was just merely doing my duty.
There were 400 of you.
Roundabout, yes.
And you approached Osawatomie, a small settlement in Kansas, and outside of town, the 400 of you encountered my client's son and one other man. My client's son, Frederick, and you shot him dead. Right?
I did not personally shoot him dead.
You saw him shot dead.
I believe somebody was shot outside of the town.
Now, we're here on a charge of murder against my client. Are you aware of anyone being charged for the murder of my client's son outside of Osawatomie, Lieutenant?
Not aware of anything.
Well, and after you murdered my client's son, you attacked Osawatomie, did you not?
We attempted to capture John Brown.
And the 400 of you attacked Osawatomie, resisted by Mr. Brown, aided by perhaps 35 men, correct?
That sounds about right.
Yes. After which, you overwhelmed its defenders, whom you outnumbered roughly 10 to 1, and you proudly captured one old man. Correct?
I did indeed capture him.
After which you burned Osawatomie, correct?
Yes.
And you seized trophies.
I didn't seize any trophies, no.
Well, you seized these items that you brought to us, including this telegram, correct?
Well, those are not trophies.
Yes. And in that telegram we find word that a Free State senator was beaten nearly to death on the floor of the United States Senate by a brave congressman from South Carolina. A telegram in which my client receives word of yet another sample of the slave driver's heroism. Thank you, Lieutenant.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Lieutenant Bass, when you captured John Brown, could you have killed him?
Oh, easily.
But you chose to take him alive?
I'm a Christian man and I'm a moral man. I went there to capture him. I'm not a murderer.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Your Honor, the government rests.
Thank you. To the United States, you may be excused. Thank you, Lieutenant. Are there any motions at this point in the trial?
Nice weapon, Lieutenant. Defense move that all charges against my client be dismissed, Your Honor.
We have a response.
Your Honor, the state has clearly shown sufficient evidence to go to the jury.
The court rules that there is sufficient evidence to go to the jury. We'll proceed with the defense witnesses.
Your Honor, thank you. The defense calls Mr. Theodore Viner.
Mr. Theodore Weiner, will you step forward and be sworn?
Right. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Viner, where do you live?
I live just outside Osawatomie, Kansas, sir.
And when did you come to Kansas?
Spring of 1854, sir.
Where did you come from?
Western Kentucky, at the edge of the Cumberland River, close to the Ohio River.
And what's your position on whether Kansas should be a free or a slave state?
Sir, God did not intend a man to own another man. It should be a free state.
Thank you. What's your trade or business?
I'm a storekeeper, sir.
And where is your store?
It's just up Mosquito Creek, California Road, the crossing there.
That would be roughly right about here on this diagram, Government's Exhibit 11?
Exactly, sir.
Thank you. Now, were you in Kansas Territory during the election for the territorial legislature in March of 1855?
Yes, I was, sir.
Did you take any active role in the election campaign?
I wouldn't say I took an active role. I was definitely aware of the situation.
Did you at least make your own views known, or were your own views known around the
People
community?
knew what I thought. They knew what I thought about that election.
And about what was the main issue in the election?
It was whether we're going to be a free state or a slave state.
And your view was strongly that it should be a free state.
Absolutely, sir.
Now, describe your experience during the period leading up to the election.
At first, it wasn't so bad, but then as it got closer to the election, quite a few ruffians running around. It got a lot worse once we got down to the election. They were coming around with guns and knives and threatening us that thought that slavery was a bad thing.
Slavery was a bad thing or a good thing?
Slavery is a bad thing.
Okay, but the people who were coming around to threaten you...
Oh, they were pro-slavery all the way, sir.
Okay. Now, were there some local people making these threats?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Were there outside people making threats?
I didn't know any of the people that came in that they're threatening us for the most part there.
What happened? Did you vote?
Absolutely.
What happened on election day?
Well, like I said, it got worse as we got close to time. You wouldn't have known it that day, but Osawatomie looked like a metropolis. There were hundreds of people all of a sudden in Osawatomie. I don't know where any of those men come. They had guns and knives, and they were threatening us not to vote for a free state. Yes, sir.
Okay. What was the outcome of the election?
Well, they swept the election, sir.
All right. Your Honor, I'm going to move the admission of Defendant's Exhibit 8, which is, in fact, a transmission from the President of the United States to the Congress of the United States regarding the events of the election in Kansas in 1855.
No objection.
Admitted.
Now, Your Honor, this is an extensive document, and in the interest of time, I'd like to essentially publish its contents by summary under Federal Rule of Evidence 1006, with the Court's permission. And I may, as I'm publishing it in this way, Your Honor, if I may be permitted to read from the slide, essentially the document reflects, this is the report from the President to the Congress, that in the 5th Legislative District containing Potawatomi Creek, a census was undertaken on March the 3rd of 1855, which found that there were, in fact, 442 voters in the district. But the same report from the President to the Congress reflects that the number of votes cast only 27 days later was 855. Now, where were the votes counted in this election?
Dutch Henry's house, sir.
Yes, and that too, Your Honor, I might point out, is reflected in the presidential report. There is no doubt. Now, who won your district?
A man called Alan Wilkinson. Never met him before that day. We didn't know him. None of us knew him. Some said he came from Missouri. We don't even know where he's from. We got to know him pretty good after that, though.
Okay. Now, who won across the state, generally speaking? Which party?
Like I said, pro-slavery won all across the state.
Your Honor, at this time I'd move the admission of the Defendant's Exhibit G, a document published in Kansas in 1856 reflecting the membership of the Kansas State Legislature, at least as elected in this election.
I believe that document's already been.
I believe that's my apologies, Your Honor. Now, I'd like you to take a look at this. First of all, actually, let me hand you a copy of the document. Does this document reflect Mr. Wilkinson's presence in the legislature? I think you'll find that it does. And does it also reflect
Yes, sir.
his political affiliation?
It says he's pro-slavery, sir.
Yes. And does this document reflect the political affiliation of all of the members of the upper house of the legislature, which is called the council?
Yes, sir, it does.
And what is that political affiliation?
Well, there's one Democrat.
One Democrat and all the rest are?
Pro-slavery.
And what about the political affiliation of the lower house of the legislature elected in the March election?
I think I can read these for you. It's pro-slavery, 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 pro-slavery.
Is there
Free
any
stater.
member of the lower house who isn't pro-slavery?
I got one right here.
Thank you. Now, in addition, I'd like you to look at the document and tell us who the Speaker of the House is.
I'm sorry, sir.
Perhaps
I have a
I
hard
can
time
help
finding
you
it.
here. The Speaker of the House is one J.H. Stringfellow.
Mr. Stringfellow,
correct?
that's correct.
And you've heard of J.H. Stringfellow.
Yes, I have.
In fact, J.H. Stringfellow is the Missourian who, before the election, said to Missourians, "I advise you one and all to enter every election district in Kansas and vote at the point of Bowie knife and revolver," and he became the Speaker of the Kansas House. Correct?
That's correct.
What sort of laws did this legislature pass?
Oh, some good laws. Good laws.
Yeah, can you describe some for me?
Well, there's the one where if you're anti-slavery, you can't vote. That's a good one.
Okay.
There's the one if you're anti-slavery, you can't sit on a jury having to do with slavery law.
Okay.
That kind of puts you in a bind if you're charged with the anti-slavery crime.
All right.
You might as well just put your neck in a noose.
Now, after slavers took over the government, did things become more peaceful along Potawatomi Creek?
If by peaceful you mean ruffians running around, threatening you all the time, yeah, that's more peaceful.
Do you have any personal experience with that?
Oh, Dutch Henry and Dutch Bill came by quite a few times.
What did they say?
They threatened me. They said, you either got to leave, or you got to be pro-slavery, or you got to leave.
Did they ever assault you?
Well, one time they came by. They gave me 3 days to get out, and within the next 2 days after that, Dutch Bill came by. He threatened me once, and I shoot him off. He's not much count. Second time, he was a little drunk, and I didn't want to hurt him. Didn't want to kill him, that is. But I beat him off with an axe handle, got him out of my place. But it was about that time I realized things are getting too hot and heavy. Something is going to go down. Something's got to happen here.
So was it about that time that you joined the Potawatomi Rifles?
That's right, sir.
And did you accompany the Potawatomi Rifles on its mission to defend Lawrence?
Yes, I did, sir.
Were you there in time?
Sir, we didn't get there in time.
On May the 24th and 25th, did you kill anybody on Potawatomi Creek?
No, sir, I didn't.
After the killings, were the Free Soil families along Potawatomi Creek molested by local pro-slavery men?
Surprisingly not. Things got a little quieter.
Thank you. No questions.
Counsel.
Mr. Weiner, just days before these killings, you and John Brown had heard that Lawrence, Kansas had been ransacked by pro-slavery men. Isn't that true?
That's correct, sir.
That made John Brown mad, didn't it?
It made all of us mad, sir.
In fact, John Brown said that something had to be done now.
We all said that, sir.
And isn't it true that John Brown said pro-slavery men had to realize that both sides would use force?
We've been saying that for quite a while, sir. We've been saying that for quite a while.
John Brown had been saying that for quite a while, hadn't he?
He said at that time, yes.
And John Brown knew that all 5 of his victims, James Doyle and William Doyle and Drury Doyle and Alan Wilkinson and William Sherman, he knew that those men were pro-slavery men, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
Objection, speculation. He can't possibly know what John Brown knows.
Objection sustained.
Mr. Weiner, after John Brown heard that Senator Sumner had been assaulted on the Senate floor, that was the finishing, decisive touch, wasn't it?
We were all upset by that, yes. That was a heinous act.
And John Brown decided that pro-slavery men had to pay, didn't he?
Like I said, we all had had enough.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. The witness is excused. The defense may call its next witness.
The defense calls Salmon Brown.
Salmon Brown, please come forward and be sworn. Would you step forward and be sworn by the bailiff, please? Sorry. And while you're there, shed your weapon.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you state your name, please?
Salmon Brown,
And what's your age, sir?
20.
And are you related to my client?
I am. He is my father.
Mr. Brown, when did you settle in Kansas?
Roughly March of 1855.
And where did you settle once you came to Kansas?
Osawatomie.
And were you the only member of your family to settle there?
No, me and my brothers settled in Kansas and their families.
Did your father ever come to join you in Kansas?
He did.
And when did he do so?
June in the summer of 1855.
Mr. Brown, what are your beliefs on the issue of slavery?
Firmly against it, absolutely.
While living in Kansas, were you involved with any activities to advance the cause of Kansas being a free state?
Yeah, we formed a loose militia called the Potawatomi Rifles
And what was the purpose of the Potawatomi Rifles?
to aid the abolitionist movement.
Was your father involved in the Potawatomi Rifles?
Yes,
Sir, are you familiar with the town of Lawrence, Kansas?
I am.
And what's the reputation of Lawrence regarding the issue of slavery?
Anti-slavery.
In December of 1855, did anything happen to Lawrence because of its anti-slavery views?
Yeah.
What happened?
It was ransacked by pro-slavery Missourian and Kansans.
And how did that ransacking end?
It ended with a brokered treaty, I believe, by the governor of Kansas.
And did you do anything during that raid?
We did. We took the Potawatomi. We actually went to Lawrence to aid the abolitionists.
And whenever you say we, who do you mean exactly?
The Potawatomi Rifles, my brothers, and my father.
Sir, are you familiar with Judge Sterling Cato?
I am, very.
And how are you familiar with him?
Judge Cato started a bogus court in the southeastern part of Kansas.
And in late 1856, did you have any occasion to come into contact with
I
Judge
did.
Cato?
We had heard that Judge Cato was going to issue warrants for the arrest of free staters, so my father told me to go out and stand out in front of his court and see if I would be arrested.
Were you arrested?
I was not.
Do you know why you weren't arrested?
I don't know the exact reason, but we believe that it was because there was no warrants had been issued yet.
What happened after that?
After that, my father confronted Judge Cato, and he just basically crawled away without saying a word.
Did you or your family have any further contact with Judge Cato after that incident?
My brother John Jr. and the Potawatomi Rifles actually protested outside of the court peacefully, no guns drawn.
What came out of that incident?
Warrants were issued for the arrest of myself, my father, my brothers, and some of the Potawatomi Rifles.
Were those warrants ever executed?
They were not.
Do you know why?
The men who were supposed to execute the warrants were killed.
Do you know who those men were that were supposed to execute the warrants?
I do.
And who were they?
They were the Doyles.
Okay, and do you know the first names of the Doyles?
William, Drury, and I believe James.
Sir, do you know what would have happened if the pro-slavery forces had actually executed those warrants?
Oh, absolutely.
And what would have happened?
We would have been
No
arrested.
objection, it's speculation.
Objection sustained.
Okay, I'll withdraw that. During May of 1856, did you become aware of anything related to the Free State issue?
We had heard that Lawrence was going to be ransacked for the second time.
And did you know why Lawrence was going to be ransacked for the second time?
We were just assuming that actually we did. We heard that they were charging free staters with treason, and apparently they were holding
a newspaper in one of the hotels there under construction treason.
What did you do after hearing that Lawrence was going to be raided?
We were going to go to Lawrence and aid the Free Staters,
And by we, who do you mean exactly?
the Potawatomi Rifles.
Did you make it in Lawrence in time?
We did not.
Okay, and why not?
We just didn't get there in time. We were stopped short.
So what happened after you stopped short?
We actually, on the way there, we were stopped by, after we'd heard, we were stopped by Mr. Gardner.
So I believe you may have your facts a little bit confused,
I'm
sir.
sorry.
I think earlier you wrote that even though some of the Potawatomi Rifles disbanded, there was a small group.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, you're fine, sir.
Well,
You're fine.
after we found out, I apologize, after we'd found out that we were too late, we actually disbanded. A lot of men went home, but a few of us stayed behind.
Okay, and why did they stay behind?
We thought that something had to be done. After hearing what happened to Lawrence, we couldn't allow the pro-slavery forces to basically scare us into slavery.
And who all in the group believed this?
Everybody. I mean, everybody, my brothers, John, the rest of the rifles that stayed.
And was your father in this group?
Yes.
So he believed that as well?
Absolutely.
If I can direct your attention to May 23rd of 1856, what happened that day?
Well, we decided to head to Potawatomi.
Okay. And whenever you say we, who specifically were
I'm sorry, the rifles.
One minute, Your Honor. Sorry about that, Your Honor.
Yeah, proceed.
Okay, thank you. And how did you get to Potawatomi?
Mr. Townsley took us on his wagon.
And what was his attitude on your way there?
At first, he was fearful. At first he wanted to run away because he was afraid of being hurt.
Okay. Sir, did your father kill anyone in Potawatomi
No.
that night? Are you certain of that?
Positive.
Okay. Did he harm anybody that night?
No, he did not.
And what are your feelings about what happened that night in Potawatomi?
It had to be done. It was the best thing that ever happened to Kansas.
And why was it the best thing?
It kept a bunch of basically land pirates from turning us into a nation of slave owners.
Thank you, sir. Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination, counsel.
Mr. Brown, isn't it true that your father hates slavery?
Absolutely.
Isn't it true that your father's goal for years, his primary goal in life, has been to end slavery?
It is.
Isn't it true that your father moved to the Kansas Territory specifically for the purpose of trying to stop Kansas from entering the Union as a slave state?
He did.
Isn't it true that this trip to Potawatomi Creek, the goal of it was to strike terror in the hearts of pro-slavery men?
It was.
Now, you were with your father when that gang went into Potawatomi Creek that night, weren't you?
I was.
And this jury has heard testimony that you stabbed James Doyle in the chest, that you slashed Drury Doyle with a sword, that you stabbed Alan Wilkinson with a sword, and that you stabbed William Sherman with a sword. Do you deny that?
Absolutely.
So their chests just burst open of spontaneous combustion?
I don't believe that was the case. I believe
You killed people that night, didn't you?
Me personally, I did not.
Pardon me?
I did not. Me personally, no.
Then who killed those people? Who slashed James Doyle in the chest with a sword?
I believe that's for you to find out.
Pardon me?
That's for you to find out.
You're under oath to tell the truth. Who slashed James Doyle in the chest?
From what I've heard, I believe it was my little brother.
Isn't it true that your father, John Brown, shot James Doyle in the head?
30 minutes after he was dead.
You saw him put the gun to his head and pull the trigger, didn't you?
You can't kill someone who's already dead.
So what was he doing, just decorating his forehead?
Letting out some frustration, I guess we could say.
Sort of like scalping a dead body to send a message of terror to people?
Maybe.
Who is it then that killed William Doyle with the swords?
Had to be another little brother.
Who?
Maybe Frederick.
Who is it that killed Drury Doyle?
I believe my brothers had the Doyles.
Who is it that killed Drury Doyle who was putting up his hands and actually sliced off his fingers? Who did that?
William or Owen. I'm sorry, Owen or Frederick.
And who is it that killed Alan Wilkinson, that slashed his throat twice?
The Wilkinsons were killed by Thompson and Weiner.
Who?
By Henry Thompson and Theodore Weiner, sir.
Your brother-in-law, Henry Thompson?
Henry Thompson was the one responsible for killing Mr.
And
Wilkinson.
who is it that killed William Sherman in
Same
Mid
men.
Creek?
Same men are responsible for that death.
And isn't it true that everybody that was on that raid that night, you and your brothers, your father, your brother-in-law, Henry Thompson, everybody was part of your Brown family except for Townsend and Weiner?
That's correct.
Now, it was 11 o'clock at night when you went to Doyle home, wasn't it?
Roughly.
And you're one of the ones that went into the Doyle home.
I was there.
And James Doyle was unarmed when he was brought outside.
I believe so.
William Doyle was unarmed.
Mm-hmm.
Drury Doyle was unarmed.
They were.
And at the Wilkinson home, Alan Wilkinson was unarmed.
I wasn't there.
At the Sherman home, Mr. Sherman was unarmed.
I wasn't there.
The whole point of this plan was to strike terror into the hearts of pro-slavery men, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
And that was by killing people, wasn't it?
That wasn't the plan.
You didn't take any ropes or shackles or chains along to take prisoners alive, did you?
I didn't have them.
Isn't it true that after that night, you made the statement that the murders of these 5 men were the grandest thing ever done in Kansas?
True statement.
You've also said it was important to show that anti-slavery men could give blows as well as take them, didn't you?
Yes.
Now, you said your father never raised a hand in these killings, but you saw your father put the gun to James Doyle's head, didn't you?
I did.
No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Redirect.
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. You're excused. The defense will call its next witness.
The defense calls Frederick Douglass.
Mr. Douglass, please step forward and be sworn.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
Could you state your name, please, sir?
My name is Frederick Douglass.
And how old are you, sir?
I'm 40 years old.
Do you know where you were born?
I believe I was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in about 1818.
And whenever you say you believe you were born, are you not sure on that?
One can never be sure. I was born a slave, and there are no official records kept of slave births and deaths. But the people that I grew up with told me that I was born in about 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland.
And who were the people that you grew up with?
Well, I grew up with any number of young slave children on the plantation. My mother was sold away when I was a baby to a neighboring plantation. And I was actually raised by my mother's mother, whose job on the plantation, because of her age and inability to work, was to look after the slave children. So essentially my grandmother, who was rearing all of the children on the plantation, told me about my early life.
Did your grandmother raise you into the point of adulthood?
Oh no. I was moved from my grandmother's care at about the age of 7. I was moved to the plantation of a man named Edward Lloyd, and I worked that plantation for 2 or 3 years as a houseboy. And then Mr. Lloyd passed away, and I was sent to Baltimore to be a houseboy for a man named Hugh Auld in Baltimore, Maryland.
And how long were you at Hugh Auld's household?
I must have been there till I was about 15. I worked the Auld house for a number of years, basically doing household chores. One of my duties was to watch the Auld's baby, and I did house cleaning and weeding the garden and the kinds of chores around the house that a young boy would do.
And sir, where did you go after you left Hugh Auld's house?
Your Honor, I object. We've only gotten to the age of 15 now of this man. His life history is irrelevant to this trial.
Counsel, would you explain why this is relevant?
Well, Your Honor, we're calling Mr. Douglas to show the horrors of slavery, which, as I believe my co-counsel has already explained, are pertinent to our defense, the defense of
Would you move
necessity.
this along to the portion that relates to John Brown, please?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Douglas, are you still a slave?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And how did you gain your freedom?
I escaped slavery after having served in Maryland. Again, I left Baltimore because I was somewhat unruly. Mrs. Auld had taught me the rudiments of reading, and she was chastised by her husband for doing so. But it gave me the taste for freedom and for knowledge. So I continued to read. I continued to teach the other slave children how to read. I was caught doing that. I was beaten severely, near death, in fact. But finally, they sent me back to Talbot County, Maryland, because of my unruliness and my lack of subservience. And I was sent to a slave breaker who was even more violent towards me. And it got to the point where I knew that I had to escape. So in about 1838, I managed to escape slavery through the help of a sympathetic black sailor who gave me his credentials and a uniform. And I managed to get to New York and ultimately to New Bedford, Massachusetts.
And sir, since you've escaped, what have you been doing in your time?
Well, I have been speaking out against slavery. I've joined the abolitionist movement. I gained some notoriety in the Northeast. I published my autobiography. And after that became somewhat successful, I began to fear that my former owners might find me. So I left the country. I went to Europe and spoke there against slavery for 2 or 3 years and earned enough money from sympathetic Europeans to indeed return to the United States and purchase my freedom.
So in the course of your activities dealing with abolitionism, have you become acquainted with John Brown Sr.?
Yes, I became acquainted with John Brown Sr. Several years ago.
I'm sorry, how many years ago?
About 10 years ago.
Okay. And what were your impressions of him during your first meeting?
I was quite impressed with him. I had heard much about him from fellow abolitionists, and they all spoke of him quite highly, of his commitment to the abolitionist movement and his passion for the equality of all human beings. When I met him, that impression was confirmed. I met him in Springfield, Massachusetts, at his home, in fact. He was extremely gracious to me. I don't believe I've ever met a white man who treated me with more respect than did what I call him Captain Brown. He was a stern man. He ruled his family, but it was clear that his family respected him. And I was struck by his deep faith. He was a deeply religious man. And I frankly believe that unlike many for whom slavery is a political issue, for John Brown, slavery was a moral issue. He viewed slavery as a serious sin against God and a serious violation of every principle of American life. And I admired him greatly for that position. And I came close to becoming one of his followers.
In listening to John Brown discuss his views on slavery, did you ever hear him relate a plan for striking back against slavery?
Yes, in fact, after that first meeting, we had an opportunity to communicate generally through the mail, the post. But whenever he was in Rochester, New York, where I live, he would visit me and stay the evening. And whenever I was in Springfield, I would visit him. And he did have a plan for ending slavery.
And can you describe the nature of that plan?
Well, the plan he described to me was to gather a band of men and to station them in the mountains in northern Virginia, southern Maryland. And those men were to raid slave plantations in northern Virginia in an attempt to free slaves and encourage them to run to freedom. The plan also involved having men stationed in Pennsylvania and New York and on the Canadian border to provide comfort and solace to those slaves who were running away in hopes of getting them into Canada to freedom. The plan was to start with 25 men, and I believe he planned to station them at 5-mile intervals, 5 each, and then move into the lowlands to free the slaves.
Was violence a part of this plan?
Well, the plan was to have these men armed and capable of defending themselves. The assumption was that slave owners would likely use violence to protect what they considered to be their property. And the plan included the notion that if they were attacked in trying to free slaves, that they would defend themselves.
At any time in this plan, or at any other time, did he ever mention killing slave owners or supporters of slavery for a reason other than self-defense?
No, and that, in my view, would be totally out of character for him. As I said, the John Brown I know is a very religious man, and the intentional taking of a human life is in his view, as bad as the intentional enslavement of a human being. Both were abhorrent to him, and I don't believe he would do that.
Thank you, sir. Nothing further.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Douglas, John Brown told you that slave owners would never give up slavery unless they felt a big stick above their heads, didn't he?
Yes, he has said things like that in the past.
John Brown hated slavery, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And John Brown dedicated his life to ending slavery, didn't he?
As did I.
And John Brown told you that slaves had a right to gain their liberty in any way they could, including use of force. Isn't that true?
As necessary to protect themselves.
John Brown told you that political action alone would never end slavery, didn't he?
He did.
So he moved it to Kansas in 1855 specifically to do everything he could to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state, didn't he?
I believe he did. That's true.
And he was the leader of his family, wasn't he?
He was.
His sons would do what he said, wouldn't they?
It was my impression that his sons had a great deal of respect for him, yes.
And John Brown had talked with you about his big plan to free slaves, which included the use of force, didn't it?
His plan that he described to me in Northern Virginia included the use of force and self-defense, yes.
So this plan included freeing slaves by force.
In self-defense.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Is there
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. You are excused. The court is aware that we have but one more witness to hear from.
That is
Counsel
correct, Your
are both admonished that you have used your time. So I would ask that both sides limit your questioning as much as possible to get the relevant facts out.
That's certainly my intention, Your Honor. Thank you for that admonition. The defense calls the defendant, my client, John Brown.
Mr. Brown, would you step forward and be sworn?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
So help me God.
How old are you, sir?
I'm 57 years old.
Where were you born?
I was born in a small town in Connecticut, but I was raised in Hudson, Ohio.
How were you educated?
Primarily, as was the custom in that time and area, by my mother, who passed away when I was a young man, and then continued my education with my stepmother. For a time, I pursued formal education back in Connecticut. That did not last long. From that point on, I was predominantly self-educated through reading periodicals, Aesop's Fables, Poor Richard's Almanac, and mostly the scriptures.
What's been your trade or profession?
I apprenticed in my father's tannery. I learned that trade. I was a tanner for a number of years. I owned a tannery myself in Pennsylvania. Besides that, I've had a number of ventures, including land speculation and other endeavors.
Are you a religious man, Mr. Brown?
I am a devoutly religious man. I consider myself a Presbyterian and a Calvinist.
And what is your opinion of the institution of slavery?
Slavery is an abomination. It is an affront to the will of God. It is an affront to the manifestation of that will here on earth. By that I mean, Christ calls us in Galatians. He instructs us that we are neither male nor female, Greek nor Jew, slave or free, but we are all one in Christ. That is the embodiment of God's will. Here on earth, that has manifested itself in the words of our fathers, founding fathers of this great country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slavery is an abomination. It flies in the face of both God's will, the will of our fathers, and what ought to be the correct law of this country.
Was there any particular incident in your youth or young manhood that engaged your attention on this issue?
There was. When I was a young man, I had occasion to do some work for my father in a couple states over. On my journey, I stayed in the home of a family acquaintance in Michigan. That man had with him a young black slave boy. There was some trivial mistake made by that young man during the course of serving dinner. The family acquaintance, I am ashamed to say, subsequently beat that young man nearly to death with a shovel pulled from his own hearth.
Now, in addition, was there an event in 1837 involving the Elijah P. Lovejoy?
There was. Mr. Lovejoy was an abolitionist who lived in St. Louis. He was a newspaper man, and he did nothing more but advocate through his vehicle of communication for the abolition of slavery. He was the slavers here in Missouri, destroyed his livelihood and ran him effectively out of the state. He fled to Illinois, where he restarted his enterprise on the east side of the Mississippi River. The slavers again burned and stoned 2 of his newspapers and ultimately shot him dead in the streets.
When you heard this, what did you do in response?
I was about 37 years old when that happened. I went to his memorial service, and I realized at that moment that the slaveholders, the slave staters, would destroy anyone, free, slave, black, or white, who got in their way. I realized then what my true calling was. I stood up in front of that body before God, and I swore an oath that I would dedicate the balance of my life to the eradication of the blight of slavery. And that's what I have done.
Now, over the ensuing years, have you worked in various ways? In addition to trying to support yourself and your family, have you worked in various ways to assist the cause of eliminating slavery? Yes or no?
Your Honor, I object at this point. I've given some leeway on not objecting, that I would object to further talk about things he's done years and years ago, and ask that we get to the point of what happened at Potawatomi Creek.
Indeed, I was leading in order to skip over that part as quickly as possible. In the ensuing years, you, of course, did do some anti-slavery work, but at a certain point you decided to come to Kansas, did you not?
I did.
And when was that?
That was in the spring, early summer of 1855.
And did you first send your sons ahead to Kansas?
My sons opted to go to Kansas first, yes.
Okay. And why did you decide to follow them in June of that year?
It had become clear once my sons were out there the extent to which the slavery advocates would go to crush any voice in opposition. It was clear that my sons were in danger. It was clear that Kansas was in grave danger of falling into the hands permanently of the slavers.
When you arrived in the summer of 1855, briefly, what was the political situation that you found?
I think we've heard adequate testimony about that at this point. The state legislature had been rammed into office by slaveholders from Missouri who crossed the border, stuffed the ballot boxes at the points of guns and bowie knives. In fact, there were approximately 1,200 registered voters in Kansas at that time. Nearly 6,000 votes were cast in that election. Now, as a result of the situation which you encountered and which your sons faced when you came to Kansas in 1855, did you, your sons, and other Free State men, did they organize themselves into any self-protection forces? Indeed, the Potawatomi Rifles.
Okay. And at one point, we've heard a great deal about this, but I take it that at one point, actually twice, you and the Potawatomi Rifles went over to Lawrence to help protect that city against incursions from Missourians. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the first time you were successful, but the second time you were not.
That is correct.
Now, let's speak about the occasion when you were unsuccessful. When you found out that Lawrence had been sacked, that despite all your efforts and hopes, despite all your organization and your willingness to go to their defense, the Free State men and women in Lawrence had been burned out of their city, what did you do?
I realized in that moment the truth in the idea that the surest way for evil to prevail in this world is for good men to do nothing. Our problem, the situation at that point, was not only was Kansas in danger if we did nothing, not only was the nation in danger if we did nothing, our lives, our families were in danger if we did nothing. The sacking of Lawrence demonstrated to us the measure of the slavers' resolve. It was time for them to understand the measure of ours.
Now, did you personally kill anyone that night?
I did not.
Were men killed?
They were.
Was the purpose of the expedition to protect yourselves and families, or to prevent slavery from coming to Kansas?
Sir, I don't believe those issues can be pulled apart. In fact, they are inextricably linked. The purpose of that mission that night was to preserve both our lives, the lives of the men and women held in bondage across this nation, and in fact, preserve the nation itself. They cannot be separated.
Why did you not turn to the law?
What law would you have me turn to?
Well, why not use political processes in Kansas to try to change the law?
There was no political process in Kansas that could change the law. The Kansas political process enacted the law that called for my head. When I appealed to the federal government for that law, we see the result of that appeal. There was no law. There was no government to whom I could turn when I was the target of the law and of the government.
So, on May the 21st of 1856, as Lawrence burned, as Senator Sumner lay near death on the floor of the United States Senate, and Missouri marauders were loose in the territory of Kansas, you were alone, were you not?
We were.
And you're still alone today, here in the heartland of your enemies, are you not?
I am.
No further questions.
Mr. Brown, you fired a bullet into the head of James Doyle, didn't you?
I did.
James Doyle was unarmed, wasn't he?
He was.
William Doyle was unarmed.
He was.
Drury Doyle was unarmed.
He was.
Allen Wilkinson was unarmed.
He was.
William Sherman was unarmed.
He was.
And you have dedicated your life to ending slavery.
I have dedicated my life to the preservation of my family and of my country.
And you are willing to use force to end slavery.
What I did that night, you say, was done out of malice and out of hate. It was, in fact, done out of love.
I haven't said anything, sir. My question to you is, you are willing to use force to end slavery.
Let me tell you a story, sir.
You are willing to use force to use slavery. Do you hear the question?
I am answering your question, sir.
And the question is, you are willing to use force to end slavery, aren't you?
And my answer is this. If you need my head on a platter or in a noose so that the country may finally see the length to which the slavers will go to entrench this abominable institution, then, sir, you may have it.
Is your answer yes?
My answer is, I did what needed to be done to preserve my life, the lives of my family, to free those men and women held in bondage, and to protect the institution that ought to be this country.
And you believe it is better that these 5 men died than that one anti-slavery man would have been driven out of Kansas, don't you?
It is bigger than one anti-slavery man being driven out of Kansas. The question is, do I believe that these 5 men ought to die to end slavery? You bet I do.
And isn't it true you think a man should take responsibility for his actions?
I absolutely believe a man should take responsibility for actions.
And do you agree with me that it's not
and, sir,
manly?
Believe me, there will be a reckoning by the Lord one day for you and every other slaver in this room who refuses to submit to the will of the Lord our God.
And do you agree with me that it's not manly for a father to hide behind the skirts of his sons and let them take the blame for what he did?
Sir, perhaps your sons wear skirts, mine do not.
Isn't it true, sir, that you were the one that led your sons that night on this raid?
I did, sir.
Your sons would not have gone on this raid but for you. Isn't that true?
That is true.
Now, sir, you heard the testimony from Lieutenant Bass that he retrieved this gun from your person. You had this gun on you that night you were captured. That afternoon you were captured, didn't you?
I have found it wise to always carry that gun when in Kansas or Missouri.
And you used this gun to shoot James Doyle in the head, didn't you?
I did.
You heard Lieutenant Bass's testimony that he retrieved this sword from you.
He did.
And this is the sword you carried that night on Potawatomi Creek, isn't it?
It is.
And you are proud of what you did at Potawatomi Creek that night, aren't you? Did you hear the question?
If those men's deaths serve to rid this country of the abomination of slavery, and if those men's deaths means that my family lives to carry on that cause, then, sir, yes, I am proud.
You had three ifs in your answer. So are you not proud? You're ashamed of what you did that night?
I am not ashamed.
So you're proud of what you did that night?
I am proud of this cause.
No further questions.
Further redirect?
None, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Thank you, counsel. Mr. Brown, you may return to counsel table.
Thank you, Judge.
Your Honor, the defense rests.
The prosecution and the defense have rested. Normally, at this point in the trial, we would give them each great latitude in making closing arguments. They don't get it tonight. The instruction the jury is given is that these 1-minute closing arguments on each side are not evidence. They are not to be considered by you as evidence. They will be summations in 1 minute by each side. Prosecution.
May it please the court. John Brown committed a despicable crime. He led these men into home invasions of 3 families and took 5 unarmed men out into the night where they were brutally slashed and hacked to cut to death, and this man put a bullet into the forehead of one of them. It was a despicable crime, and I'm asking you not to let this man get away with murder. The judge will read you instructions, and ladies and gentlemen, I remind you we are a nation of laws and not men. And there is a law against murder, and there is a law called accomplice liability that the judge will explain to you. And that means that an accomplice, one who aids and works with and helps a crime happening, is just as liable as the principal. This man was not just an accomplice, he was the leader of this group. He was responsible for every act they did that night under the law, because we are a nation of laws and not men. And that means, you've heard many times we're a nation of laws and not men, but what it means is one man cannot set himself up as judge, jury, and executioner to kill people because their political beliefs don't agree with his own. And people watch what happens in a trial. People in Boone County will watch this trial. People in Missouri, people in the Kansas Territory, people across the country will watch. And the message you want to send is, whether you're pro-slavery or whether you're anti-slavery, you cannot kill people with impunity who disagree with your political views. You cannot take the law into your own hands. You put your faith in the court system. This man committed murders, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let him get away with it. And if he wants to be a martyr, ladies and gentlemen, then give him the rope.
All right. Defense, closing argument, 1 minute.
Your Honor, may I approach?
We gave you 1 minute. I think I gave him a little more than 1 minute, so move as rapidly as you can.
I will move as rapidly as possible, Your Honor, but with the court's indulgence, my client's life is at stake. These good people have listened a good long time, but there's something else that needs to be said. Now, this case asks you to decide what a good man is permitted to do in the face of evil. Not just any evil, but a crime. Crime against a people, a crime against 2 continents, a crime against God, a crime against the idea of America itself. Now, the government's here to talk about crime as well, and understandably, their talk is all about the deaths of the Doyles and the Wilkinson and the Sherman, and I grieve for all those families. But can I have defense exhibit, please? When I listen to Mr. Swingle asking for vengeance for those neatly shaven white faces in their starched collars donned for the Kansas City photographer, another image rises before me. A naked slave facing death at the hands of other white men in collars, some of them sitting in this room. A man in chains with nothing but his own natural dignity to sustain him against the awful thing that's about to come. But a man for all of that. And his is the image of a crime that is infinitely greater than anything that happened on Potawatomi Creek. Slavery is an old crime, a crime so old that it was old when Scripture was written, and in its antiquity and the old Hebrews practice of it has permitted its defenders, including the president of the state university, to claim that God sanctions human bondage, which is a vicious fallacy. One might have hoped that the great crime of slavery would have been left behind in the old world, but it crept into our American Eden. And in doing so, it has warped us, particularly those of us who live with it every day in Columbia, Missouri. Slavery has made us blind. We do not see the agony of black men and women because we have willed ourselves to see them as less than human. Slavery has made us deaf. We do not hear the screams at the whipping post or the anguish of mothers sold away from their children, sons from their fathers. Slavery has made us dishonest. We look into the faces, the coffee-colored faces of the Tom Basses in our homes and pretend to see not our children, but a unit of property with what must surely be a coincidental resemblance to our husbands and fathers and sons. Slavery has made us stupid, able to witness the intellectual power and moral quality of Frederick Douglass and see not a man, but a form of surprisingly clever livestock. Slavery has made us both callous and foolish, immune to the tragedy of a people forced to drag out their existence in stations far below their gifts, and heedless to the waste of all that they, if unbound, could bring to our common country. And slavery has made us cruel. We have become so habituated to the violence inseparable from the daily subjugation of black people, the shackle, the club, the lash, the noose, that violence has become the natural answer, our natural answer to anyone black or white who would thwart us. John Brown, long years ago, saw slavery for what it is, and unlike most of us, he did not close his eyes. He did not excuse the country on the grounds of history or economic interests or the complexities of sectional politics. He did not excuse himself on the grounds that he was only one man standing against a deep-rooted evil. Now, Mr. Swingle basically says that opposition to slavery, however awful slavery may be, does not justify the killing of 5 men. The law, he says, did not permit John Brown and the Free Soil men of Kansas to return blow for blow. The law, he says, held its protecting hand over the Doyles, Wilkinson, and Sherman, and Mr. Swingle demands that John Brown be hanged for breaking the law. He speaks of law. But the slavers had stolen the law in Kansas. They stole the election. There can be no doubt of that. And with the election,
you have just a little time to sum up.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please, I beg your indulgence. With the election, the slavers stole the government, the mechanism for enforcing and making the law. The slavers made it impossible for any free state man to live in Kansas in safety. The slavers took the legislature. The slavers took the courts. The slavers even co-opted the national government. And if all of this were not enough, slavers had Missourian raiders coming over to do their work. Not the work of the law, but the very sort of brigandage that's been described here. A free state settler in Kansas in 1856 was alone. Now, nonetheless, you might argue that the great moral crime of slavery cannot justify the killing of these particular men in this particular place. But I look at these men and what they stood for and what they did, and unlike John Brown, I harden my heart. The government, the very government that has since its founding nourished human slavery, that government claims that John Brown must die for aiding and abetting 5 deaths, and yet the dead, in this case, actively subverted the institutions of government upon which the legitimacy of law itself depends, and they aided and abetted the enslavement and rape and torture of millions of generations yet unborn.
I abided by the 1-minute time limit. This is atrocious.
Thank you, counsel. Would you sum up?
To conclude, slavery is a monstrous evil. It's devoured those among us with African blood. But unless free men and women summon the courage to oppose it with any necessary weapon, it will devour the rest of us at will. You have had the clarity of vision to see what must be done, and by your verdict, you will say whether John Brown has done well or ill. And by your verdict, you will pronounce judgment not only on him, but on yourselves. Think well.
Mayor, may I have 30 seconds to respond?
You may.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he gave you a nice speech where he told you that slavery is bad. What is the important thing he did not say to you? My client is not guilty of these murders. Ladies and gentlemen, I've heard the criminal justice system described many times as a chain that's only as strong as its weakest link. You have the witnesses willing to come forward and testify, and you heard from them, the prosecutor putting on the case, the judge presiding over it, and one link in that chain is the jury using its common sense and human wisdom to reach the right result. Take that common sense with you back into the jury and send the message that whether you're pro-slavery or anti-slavery, you can disagree on the issues, but if you start murdering people because their political beliefs are different from your own, you will face a murder sentence of first-degree murder, and you will get the death penalty.
Thank you, counsel. Thank you, counsel. The most egregious error that a trial judge can make is not reading the instructions. However, I am going to ask that the instructions be taken to the jury room. They are instructions that relate to a presumption of innocence, to the elements of the crimes that have been charged, to the necessity defense, to the domestic terrorism charge, and finally, as to each count of the murder. I ask that the jury retire, and those instructions will be given to you. I ask you, please, to deliberate as quickly as you possibly can. And let me say to those gathered here, this is not the normal way that we would operate in particularly a capital trial. However, I am so grateful for the patience of this jury and of the people who have participated this evening that I simply want to tell you that this is not the way it would normally happen, but in the interest of your lives and the lives of everyone around here, I ask the jury now to retire and take with you the verdict form, and you will be getting the instructions, and return just as quickly as you can.